If I'd known how that night would end, I never would have gone to Walmart. It was almost 11 p.m., and I had one thing in mind: grab a few essentials, get out, and head home. The store was nearly empty, its parking lot dotted with just a handful of cars. I parked close to the entrance, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a cold glow on the cracked pavement. The automatic doors slid open with a faint hiss, and I stepped inside, greeted by the hum of harsh overhead lights and the faint smell of floor cleaner. A single cashier stood at her register near the entrance, scrolling through her phone. She didn't even glance up as I walked by. The store felt unsettlingly quiet. Aside from a faint murmur of music playing over the speakers, the place was dead. I grabbed a cart and headed toward the grocery section. My list was shortbread, milk, and some snacks. It should have been an easy in-and-out trip, but something about the silence made every step feel louder than it should have. As I turned down the bread aisle, I spotted the first sign that something wasn't right. A single loaf of bread lay on the floor, flattened as if someone had stepped on it. The rest of the shelves were neatly stocked, making the mess stand out even more. I glanced around, but there was no one else in sight. "Okay," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. "It's just bread. No big deal." I grabbed what I needed and moved on, heading toward the dairy section. As I approached the refrigerated displays, I heard it, the faint squeak of a cart wheel. I stopped, my grip tightening on the handle of my own cart. The sound came from somewhere near the back of the store, rhythmic and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing faintly. The squeaking stopped. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. Then I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. "You're being paranoid," I muttered. I grabbed a carton of milk and a few other items before heading toward the snacks. As I turned down the chip aisle, I stopped in my tracks. At the far end of the aisle, a man stood with his back to me, his shoulders hunched. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the shelves. "Excuse me," I said, my voice louder than I intended. The man didn't respond. "Hey," I tried again, taking a step closer. "You okay?" Still nothing. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Something about his stance, the way his head tilted slightly to the side, made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything else, the man turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner without a word. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself it was just some weirdo minding his own business. But as I pushed my cart down the aisle, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been standing there for me to notice him. After grabbing the last item on my list, I headed toward the self-checkout lanes near the front of the store. The cashier was gone now, her register unattended. The store felt even emptier than before, the silence stretching uncomfortably as I scanned my items. Halfway through, I heard the faint sound of something falling in one of the aisles behind me. I froze, my hand hovering over the scanner. It wasn't a loud crash, just a soft thud, like a box or can hitting the floor. I turned, peering over my shoulder, but the aisles were empty. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered, scanning the last of my items. As I reached for my wallet, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. On the security monitor above the checkout lanes, a grainy black and white feed cycled through different parts of the store. In one of the aisles, the man I'd seen earlier was standing perfectly still, staring directly at the camera. My stomach dropped. The image disappeared as the feed switched to another camera, then another, cycling through the empty aisles and parking lot. When it cycled back to the aisle, the man was gone. I finished checking out as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I bagged my items. I glanced toward the exit, half expecting to see him waiting there, but the doors were clear. I pushed my cart outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The parking lot was just as empty as before, but it didn't feel safe. I loaded my groceries into the trunk of my car, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound felt louder than it should have. As I closed the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and started the engine. I was ready to leave when I noticed something on my windshield. A single slip of paper, wedged under the wiper blade. My heart pounded as I got out and grabbed it, unfolding it with trembling hands. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 3 words. "You're not alone." I dropped the note and jumped back into the car, locking the doors again. As I sped out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the lot, barely visible in the pale glow of the streetlights, was the man. He was just standing there, watching me leave. I didn't realize it then, but that note was just the beginning. The drive home was short, but my nerves didn't settle. The man's face lingered in my mind. How he stood at the edge of the parking lot, watching, unmoving. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Creeps are just part of life, right? But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. When I pulled into my driveway, my headlights lit up the front of my small house. Everything looked as it should, but I sat in the car for a moment, scanning the shadows just to be sure. Nothing moved. Inside, I tried to shake the feeling. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, something I rarely did. Then I put the groceries away, my mind replaying the events at Walmart. I was halfway through unpacking when I remembered the note. "You're not alone." I had left it crumpled on the passenger seat, but the words burned in my mind. The handwriting was jagged, like whoever wrote it was in a rush or shaking. By the time I got ready for bed, I had almost convinced myself to let it go. Almost. The next day, I went about my routine as best as I could. Work was uneventful, and I managed to avoid telling anyone what had happened. Felt ridiculous to even think about. But when the day ended, I realized I needed to make another trip to Walmart. I hadn't grabbed everything on my list the night before, and the thought of going back made my stomach churn. But I told myself it would be fine. It was just a store. By the time I arrived, it was already dark. The parking lot was busier than the night before, though still far from crowded. I parked close to the entrance, the overhead lights buzzing faintly as I stepped out of the car. This time, I walked in with a plan. Get in, get out, don't look at anyone. The store felt different, though. Busier, yes, but the tension was still there. I grabbed a cart and headed for the electronics section. I was picking up a charger for my phone, a quick grab-and-go item. As I rounded the corner into the aisle, I stopped dead in my tracks. Near the display shelves, a cart was overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. There was no one around. I glanced up and down the aisle, but it was empty. No employees, no other customers, just the mess. "Hello," I called, my voice low. No response. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the area. That's when I noticed the streaks on the floor. They weren't immediately obvious, but in the harsh fluorescent light, I could see them. A faint trail, smeared across the tiles, leading toward the back of the aisle. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy. My stomach tightened. "Anyone there?" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I backed out of the aisle, my heart racing. I didn't want to follow the trail. I headed toward the front of the store, deciding I didn't need the charger after all. But as I passed the self-checkout, I froze. The security monitor above the registers was cycling through its usual feeds. Aisle after aisle of grainy, black and white footage. In one of the feeds, I spotted a figure. It was the man. He was standing near the overturned cart. His head tilted slightly as he stared directly at the camera. The image flickered, and when the feed cycled back, he was gone. I didn't wait. I abandoned my cart and headed straight for the exit, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I stepped into the parking lot, the cool night air hit me like a wall. I felt exposed under the overhead lights like a target. I walked quickly to my car, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like metal dragging across concrete. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came from behind me, near the side of the building where the dumpsters were. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows. There, near the edge of the lot, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from behind the dumpsters, dragging something behind him. It was the man. He held a crowbar in one hand, its metal edge scraping against the pavement. He looked up, and for the first time I saw his face clearly. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his mouth set in a twisted grin. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he started walking toward me, his pace slow but deliberate. I backed away, fumbling with my keys as panic set in. "Stay back!" I yelled, my voice trembling. He didn't stop. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I bolted for my car. The sound of his footsteps followed me, heavy and relentless. I reached the driver's side door, yanking it open and throwing myself inside. Just as I slammed the door shut, he reached the car. The crowbar slammed against the window with a deafening crack, the glass spiderwebbing under the force. I screamed, fumbling to start the engine as he raised the crowbar again. The second strike was even harder, and I could see the glass starting to give. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, slamming my foot on the gas. The man stumbled back, his grin never faltering, as I sped out of the lot. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the parking lot, watching me leave. But he wasn't alone this time. 2 other figures stepped out from the shadows, joining him. They all stood there, their eyes following my car as I disappeared into the night. I thought I'd escaped, but the worst was yet to come. I didn't go straight home. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart was still racing, and every shadow along the road seemed like it could be hiding someone. I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to calm down, but my mind kept replaying the man's face. The way he grinned as he swung the crowbar, the sudden appearance of the other 2 figures in the parking lot. Finally, I pulled into a 24-hour diner just outside town. The thought of being around other people, even strangers, was the only thing keeping me from losing it completely. The place was nearly empty, save for a waitress behind the counter and an older man nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. I slid into a booth near the window, my eyes darting to the glass every few seconds. The waitress came over with a menu, her smile warm but tired. "Late night?" she asked. "You could say that," I muttered, forcing a weak smile. I ordered coffee, but as she walked away, I realized something. The note. It had been on my passenger seat after the first night. I'd left it there. Now it was gone. My stomach churned as I stared at the empty seat beside me. The thought that someone had been in my car while I was inside Walmart made my skin crawl. I barely touched my coffee, my eyes constantly flicking toward the parking lot outside. I didn't see anyone, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I stayed for half an hour before finally working up the nerve to leave. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a few minutes, scanning the street for anything unusual. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses dark except for a few porch lights. I stepped out of the car and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I checked the windows, the back door, even the closets. Nothing was out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house set me on edge. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and went into the living room, flipping on the TV for some background noise. That's when I saw it. On the coffee table was a piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I hadn't put it there. My pulse quickened as I picked it up, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was another note, written in the same jagged handwriting as the first. "You're not safe." My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the room, my eyes darting to the locked windows and the front door. How had it gotten inside? The sound of footsteps on the porch made me freeze. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone outside my house, I whispered, my voice barely audible. They're walking around the porch. The dispatcher's voice remained calm. Are your doors and windows locked? Yes, I said, glancing toward the front door. Stay inside. Officers are on their way. I stayed on the line, clutching the phone like a lifeline as the footsteps continued. They stopped near the back of the house. I heard a faint scraping sound, like metal on wood, followed by a low thud. Someone's trying to get in? I whispered, tears pricking at my eyes. Stay calm, the dispatcher said. Do you have anywhere you can hide? I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me. Yes, I said. I moved to the hallway closet, squeezing myself inside and closing the door as quietly as I could. The dispatcher stayed on the line, her voice steady as she reassured me that help was on the way. Then, everything went silent. The footsteps stopped, the scraping sound ceased, and all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Hello, I whispered into the phone. I'm still here, the dispatcher said. Officers should be there any minute. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps inside. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest as I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stifle a sob. The footsteps moved through the house, slow and deliberate, as if the intruder was searching for something or someone. I could hear drawers opening, objects being moved, and then silence. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound, but the only thing I could make out was the faint hum of the dispatcher's voice in my ear. Suddenly, the closet door jerked open. The man stood there, his face inches from mine, his grin wide and menacing. Found you, he whispered. Before I could react, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the room. The man's grin faltered, and he turned to run, but the sound of police shouting outside stopped him in his tracks. Hands up! An officer barked, his gun drawn as he stepped into the house. The man dropped the crowbar he was holding, his hands rising slowly. I stumbled out of the closet, gasping for air as the officers cuffed him and led him outside. I sat on the couch, shaking, as one of the officers asked me questions. Do you know him? No, I said, my voice trembling. I've never seen him before this week. The officer nodded, scribbling something in his notebook. He had a car parked down the street. We'll look into it. Why me? I asked, my voice breaking. Why did he pick me? The officer didn't answer. Instead, he gave me a faint smile and said, You're safe now. But I wasn't sure I believed him. The man may have been arrested, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The police left just as the sun began to rise, leaving me with a broken door and a house I no longer felt safe in. I spent the morning cleaning up the mess, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't scrub away the feeling that someone was still watching me. The officer had assured me Warren Hodge was in custody, but the details he shared about the notes and photos haunted me. Why had he been following me? And how long had this been going on? I tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on fixing the door and getting through the day. By the evening, I had convinced myself that the nightmare was over. But that night, as I sat on the couch with the TV on for background noise, I heard something. A faint sound, like paper sliding against wood. I froze, my heart pounding as I turned toward the front door. Through the glass panel, I saw something being slipped under the door. A folded piece of paper. I didn't move for a moment, my mind racing. Finally, I forced myself to stand and walk toward the door. I picked up the paper, unfolding it slowly. My hands trembled as I read the message inside, written in the same jagged handwriting as the previous notes. You're not safe. My stomach twisted as I backed away from the door. I checked the locks again, even though I knew they were already secure. I grabbed my phone and called the police. There's another note, I told the dispatcher, my voice shaky. Someone slipped it under my door. We'll send an officer, the dispatcher assured me. I sat by the window watching the street outside while I waited. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. When the officer arrived, I handed him the note and told him what had happened. Are you sure it wasn't here earlier? He asked, frowning as he examined it. I'm sure, I said firmly. I was sitting right here when it was slipped under the door. The officer nodded, though his expression was skeptical. We'll patrol the area tonight, he said. Call us if you hear or see anything else. As the officer drove away, I tried to calm myself, but the unease lingered. I double-checked the locks one last time before heading to bed, though I doubted I'd sleep. At around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something tapping against the window. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I listened. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was faint but deliberate, coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone and crept down the hallway, my footsteps silent against the floor. When I reached the living room, I stopped. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued. I took a deep breath and yanked the curtain aside. Standing on the other side of the window was a man. It wasn't Warren. This man was younger, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with a manic intensity. He grinned at me through the glass, his teeth yellowed and uneven. In his hand, he held a knife, the blade catching the faint glow of the streetlight. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone as I dialed 911. "There's a man outside my house. There's a man outside my house." I whispered into the phone, my voice shaking. He's staring right at me. He has a knife." "Stay calm," the dispatcher said. "Are your doors locked?" "Yes," I replied, glancing at the deadbolt to make sure it was secure. "Do not engage with him. Officers are on their way," she assured me. The man's grin widened as if he could hear the conversation. He tapped the knife against the glass, the soft click 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 echoing in the silent room. I backed away slowly, clutching the phone tightly. "He's still at the window," I whispered. Then, without warning, he moved. He walked along the side of the house, disappearing from view. "He's going around the back," I told the dispatcher, panic rising in my chest. "Is there another way inside?" "There's a back door," I said. My stomach churned as I remembered the weak lock on the sliding door in the kitchen. "Stay where you are," she instructed. "The officers will be there any moment." Couldn't wait. The thought of him getting inside was unbearable. I crept toward the kitchen, gripping a heavy flashlight I'd grabbed from the counter. The sliding door came into view, and my heart sank. The lock had been forced open, the door left slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The soft creak of a floorboard behind me made my blood run cold. I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The man was standing in the hallway, his grin still plastered across his face. "Nice place," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Get out," I said, my voice trembling. He took a step closer, the knife glinting in the dim light. "Why would I do that?" he asked, tilting his head. "We're just getting started." I swung the flashlight, but he was faster than I expected. He ducked and lunged, grabbing my arm and yanking me forward. We struggled, the flashlight clattering to the floor as I tried to wrench free. His grip was strong, the blade of the knife dangerously close to my side. "Stop fighting," he hissed, his breath hot against my ear. "It's pointless." But I didn't stop. I kicked wildly, my foot connecting with his knee. He stumbled back with a grunt, and I seized the opportunity. I grabbed the flashlight from the floor and swung it as hard as I could, hitting him square in the face. He cried out, dropping the knife as he fell to the ground. Blood streamed from his nose, and he glared up at me with a fury that sent chills down my spine. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. The man scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy as he tried to grab the knife. "Don't move!" a voice shouted from outside. The front door burst open, and 2 officers stormed in, their guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them." The man froze, his hands hovering in the air as the officers closed in. I slumped against the wall, my entire body trembling as they cuffed him and dragged him outside. The officers questioned me for hours, piecing together what had happened. "He's connected to Warren Hodge," one of them explained. "Looks like they'd been planning something together for a while." "Why me?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The officer hesitated before replying. "We're still figuring that out." A few weeks later, I got a call from the detective handling the case. "We found something in his car," he said. "It's unsettling." "What is it?" I asked, my stomach knotting. "Photos of you, dozens of them. Some from your house, some from Walmart. It looks like he'd been following you for months." I sat in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. "We also found notes," he continued. "References to you but also to Hodge. Looks like they were working together." But Hodge was in custody, I said. Yeah, the detective replied. He was. And this guy wasn't happy about it. That night, as I locked up the house and double-checked the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The man was gone, but the fear he'd left behind lingered. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside, sent my heart racing. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw his grin.